Welcome back. Now, it's dedicated to share Africa's rich and exciting resource of untold stories recalling history and what's happening now in culture and in social media. Well, that's a new podcast titled African Dawn Podcast, hosted by award-winning artist Kwesi Owusu. The podcast launched with world-renowned percussionist, composer and poet Eugene Skeef, who shared his stories about the day Soweto exploded back in 1976, as well as incredible testimonies about his life with Steve Biko. Owusu and Skeef join us via Zoom to tell us more about the African Dawn Podcast. Gentlemen, a very good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good morning, Simpiwe.
Good morning, good morning.
Good to have you both on the show. Kwesi, I'm going to start with you. Give us more background into what the African Dawn Podcast is all about and what really inspired it.
I think that what is really fascinating about this time is that Africans are beginning to tell their stories, not from the sidelines, but from the mainstream of the global media. And this initiative, very, very exciting, is actually part and parcel of that process. And we are so privileged to start from South Africa with one of your most distinguished artists, Eugene Skeef. And there's so many fascinating stories coming up. The podcast is on all the major global platforms and very soon to be launched. So it's really, really exciting to be here this morning sharing this wonderful news with you.
Now, Eugene, in the first episode of the podcast, you share intimate details about your work with Steve Biko, yeah? Tell us more about this.
Yeah, continuing, thank you, my brother. Continuing from where Kwesi left off, that these are untold stories. If there's one story in our world or in the world in general that cannot be told enough, it's the story of Steve Biko. I'm fortunate to have met Steve Biko when I was a young man, a young student, and I met him at the Alan Taylor Residence for Black Students when he was studying medicine in Wentworth in Durban. I'm from a township called Eklamont and Dunduma on the outskirts of Durban. And one of my skills is as an artist. So in Steve Biko's presence, I drew the original Black power clenched fist. You know that symbol.
Yes,
I'm the artist who drew that. And I started driving at 9 years old on the potholes in Dunduma. And so my driving skills, by the time I met Steve Biko, were honed even higher than those of drivers who race in Formula One. And so I became the getaway driver. I became Steve Biko's driver, and I drove him, and my skills were relied on to escape from the clutches of this special branch, the security branch, when they were chasing us. So I drove, we took tours around the country to the then Ongoy, University of Zululand, to schools, to Turfroop, to Cape Town, to Grahamstown, conscientizing people, conscientizing the community, and building schools as well, to Dutu in South Coast, and on the outskirts of Alice, where Fort Hare is based,
yes,
and the Federal Theological Seminary. So I'm that artist.
And one other subject you touched on is your time in London, yeah? Tell us more about it.
I came into exile in 1980. I was forced to flee because of my work as an activist with Steve Biko and others, Sats Cooper, Strini Mudley, and so forth, Aubrey Mkwape, Harry Nengwe. So I landed in 1980, and that's when I met, one of the first people I met actually was Kwesi Owusu, coming from Ghana. And he was part of a groundbreaking poetry and music and movement group called African Dawn. I had started Malo Poets in South Africa, Malo Poets, mixed word spirits and poets, and we got together with Kwesi and others, other South Africans and other Africans, Pitiga Ntuli, Mulife P, and many others, and we started shaking things in the UK. We were the main people making things happen culturally and raising people's awareness of the ills of apartheid that had to be destroyed.
Right, right. Now, Kwesi, what issues or subjects do you highlight, and why are they worth shining the spotlight on?
I think the podcast really is about telling particular stories that are important to our own history. We never tell it enough. I mean, if you take South Africa alone, I'm sure over the period, there have been so many fascinating stories that have not been told. And looking at what Eugene has provided for us, it's just fascinating. There are particular stories that still send shivers down my spine. You know, the day his mother, to protect him from the special branch, actually banned all his creative works in his absence, of course. There was a time when he had to rush through and get into Soweto, you know, rush through the roadblocks and so on. And of course, beautiful moments of music as well. Wonderful, lots and lots of music. I've actually become an expert in South African music, just working on this. Don Laka, Julian Bahula, Mervyn Africa, Hugh Masekela, Lady Smith, Black Bambazo, and a whole lot. It's been really wonderful working on this. And I just hope people would actually go and check out these stories as soon as we get launched. It's wonderful.
Now, Kwesi, let's talk about the thought process behind selecting your guests, such as Eugene Skeef.
Can you repeat that? I didn't quite get that one.
Let's talk about the thought process, you know, behind selecting your guests on this podcast.
Actually, I was lost for choice. And but the beautiful thing is that there'll be so many other guests. It's limitless. But starting with Eugene was kind of special because obviously there was an affiliation there, and his work is so wonderful. But if I go through the list of guests coming up, it's going to be a long day and very fascinating. So definitely, you know, look out for the list of people who are going to appear. High, low, untold stories from across Africa, not just from one country. There were over 50 people already lined up from West Africa, East Africa, the stories, the filmmakers, poets, musicians, maybe even some politicians, and maybe you. Why not? I'm sure you have some wonderful stories to tell.
Now, Eugene, what's the significance of the title, The African Dawn Podcast?
The African Dawn, the title, in addition to the title being the title of the multi-arts group that Kwesi founded in London, it is also an affirmation of the fact that Africa is the source of humankind. Africa is the source of mathematics. Africa is the source of the urban groove. Every beat that permeates urban music, hip hop, jazz, whatever, is sourced in Africa. Africa is the dawn of some of the greatest ideas. Africa is the dawn of ideas that make sure that we live in harmony with nature. It's the dawn that has to be looked out for. We need to stay awake in this iniquitous night, this midnight, this cold night of evil and the absence of selflessness, not the selflessness that Steve Biko taught. And we need to be awake to realize that the dawn that is coming is the one that we need to live by.
What happened to the dawn, though? Because, you know, every time it dawns on everybody, it brings about a whole lot of excitement. But it seems like such excitement has been eroded by the various social ills and the debilitating levels of poverty.
Yeah.
Well, what is really interesting about the dawn is that you get it daily. It happens every day.
Yes.
And so we rise with hope every single day when we see the dawn.
Yeah, thank you, Kwesi. Simpiwe, when I greeted you earlier, I said that I rise early, I'm as fresh as a daisy because I carry the sun in my soul. The dawn, without the dawn, there is no life. Like Kwesi, my brother Kwesi just said, it's cyclical. We breathe in, we breathe out. Music moves in cycles. So the ills will be repaired. The one thing that needs to happen is that the leaders, like our leaders in our country and throughout Africa and the whole world, every political leader needs to embrace the selflessness of Steve Biko. Steve Biko was about love, you know. So once we embrace love and we are imbued with that, we then influence everything around us, you know, because every act of life has to be an act of beauty. Love is the most radical revolutionary act.
Eugene, I do understand that the next topic will be around Begim Selego. Are you at liberty to share?
Yes, Begim Selego was my closest friend. You know, he was born and raised in Lamontville, a township on the outskirts of Durban. And we met as young people. He used to come to Claremont when he played with the pop group of way back then, and the Expressions, Lamontville Expressions. And I knew him then. And then I also introduced him to Steve Biko as a young musician, a genius, the greatest musician who came out of South Africa, not one of the greatest. I say this, I put my head on the block, the most gifted genius. Even when we went into exile, when I was forced into exile, I had to take him with me because he could not tolerate being without me in South Africa, because I played that role of nurturing him and looking after him and protecting him. He would practice for 72 hours nonstop, 3 full days, playing around the cycles, which made him develop the most phenomenal technique, so that in the UK, in Sweden, in the UK, sorry, in Europe, in Sweden, in the UK, in the States, he fascinated classical musicians as well as musicians from all sorts of backgrounds, because his technique was just, you know, beyond, was immeasurable. You know, he was just phenomenal. So he was our greatest voice as a harmonicist. He taught even those who inspired him, like Winston Mankunku, he taught them back. What's his name? Victor Ndlaziluana, the founder and leader of the Jazz Ministers. You can name anybody. They all learned from Beggy about advanced harmony. So he was the most incredible musician who came from South Africa. I'm very honored to have been associated with him. His solo piano tracks, some of which will feature in the soundtrack of the podcast, are just mesmerizing. To quote Kwesi, it's as if an angel descended and played, you know?
Kwesi, so who is this podcast aimed at? I mean, who are you targeting?
Essentially, it's everybody. Basically, podcast is almost like a little radio or television on the net that you just plug in and listen. The advantage is that it has all the stories there, and there's a variety of stories that I think would interest everybody. So it's not for any particular group of people, but it is literally for everybody. Everybody who has ears to hear and who is interested in joining this exciting new beginning.
So how do we, log on? Like, please share the details of this podcast.
Definitely, I think the links are there. We definitely will share that with you, so that everybody can log on and start hearing. But we came out with a trailer, and that's really causing a lot of waves, actually, around the world. But that is going to follow with about 5 episodes on our wonderful artist, Eugene Skeef, who is the star of the show at this moment. And I can't wait to unravel the really, really exciting stories that we have put together to show the brilliance, not just of himself, not just of South Africa, but the whole of the African continent and its ingenuity.
Now, Eugene, no doubt that this podcast is a game changer. So for those listening to, each episode for the very first time, and after listening at the end of each episode, I'm sure, and I'm 100% sure that they would leave a different person. They would leave a changed person, changed for the better. So what is it that you're hoping the listeners will take away after listening to this podcast?
It is a game changer indeed. Thanks for that point. Even now, Simpiwe, my brother, as we sit here, the trailer, like Kwesi says, is creating waves. I get messages from all across the world, but in particular, the continent of Africa, and even more in particular, South Africa, where I mentor younger people who are poets and musicians and dancers and visual artists. And all of them send me messages via WhatsApp. I use WhatsApp a lot and social media in general. Mm-hmm. And all of them are saying they can't wait for the whole thing to flow, because they are inspired already, because the essence of this podcast is that it is reinforcing individuals' sense of well-being. The same thing that Steve Biko, the philosophy that he taught us, which is zimele. You are independent. You must be self-reliant. Yes. Stand on your own in the milieu, in the community, in the group, and find your voice. So everybody is taking from this the fact that it reinforces their own sense of well-being and self-reliance. That is the major impact of it.
Yeah, and one may wonder, with so much happening in the world, in South Africa, and in people's personal lives, how does one find their voice?
Not to put too fine a point on it, and not to appear maybe too crystal gazerly, but I'm 72 years old right now. I started reading at 2. I started writing poetry at 5.
Sure.
And I'm in tune with young people today. Even yesterday, when I was doing my meditative power walk, because I do a power walk every day, my phone rang from an artist, a singer called Sipiwe Dulze in South Africa, in Joburg. And he wanted to learn from me about meditation. So I meditate every day. I do yoga. I do deep breathing, circular breathing, and that reinforces me. That makes me able to deal with anything, with someone who's trying to be violent towards me, with an unkind person, somebody bumping against me on the sidewalk because they are caught up on their phone, So meditation, some people can call it prayer, you can use whatever word, but to meditate, which is to focus your energy and center yourself and align yourself with your own, if you like, with the God in you, with the divine infinite power that you have, because we are all aspects of the almighty force. You align yourself with that and you are ready to go, whether you're going to a supermarket or to put petrol in your car or to go and flush the toilet, whatever the action is you're entering, you are in control of it.
All right.
That is the message.
Eugene Skeef and Kwesi Owusu, lovely chatting to you two gentlemen. This conversation really has been an eye-opener. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was the hosts of the African Dawn podcast, Kwesi Owusu. With him was world-renowned percussionist, composer and poet Eugene Skeef, speaking to us about a podcast dedicated to sharing Africa's rich and exciting resources of untold stories, recording history and what's happening right now in culture and in social media.